The beach stretched endlessly before them, a graveyard of abandoned vehicles and equipment scattered across the sand like broken toys. May 1940, the coast of Dunkirk, France, and behind a thin line of exhausted soldiers stood the entire British Expeditionary Force. Over 300,000 men trapped with their backs to the sea, waiting for rescue that might never come. The German Wehrmacht, unstoppable, victorious, was closing in for the kill. But what the Nazis didn't know was that a small group of Allied rearguard forces was about to write one of the most heroic chapters in military history. A chapter where men would willingly trade their lives, their futures, their dreams for the survival of hundreds of thousands of brothers in arms. If you believe courage isn't just about winning, but about sacrifice that changes the course of history, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to hear is a story of the bravest men who ever lived, and how their final stand at Dunkirk made D-Day, made victory in Europe, made the free world possible. This is the story of the rearguard, the forgotten heroes who held the line so others could live. Imagine standing on that beach, the smell of burning oil thick in your throat, the sound of distant artillery growing louder with each passing hour. You watch as boats, fishing vessels, pleasure yachts, Royal Navy destroyers desperately ferry soldiers across the English Channel. You know that every minute counts. Every second the evacuation continues is another life saved. And you know, you won't be on one of those boats. You're staying behind. To understand the magnitude of what these men did, we need to go back 6 weeks. Back to when the war in Western Europe was still young, still full of confidence and outdated strategies. The British Expeditionary Force had crossed the Channel in September 1939, ready to stand alongside their French allies against Nazi Germany. American military advisors watched nervously from across the Atlantic, knowing that if Britain fell, the United States would face a Nazi-dominated Europe alone. President Roosevelt understood the stakes, even if America wasn't yet in the war. Britain's survival was America's survival. The British and French armies were formidable on paper. Millions of men, thousands of tanks. But they were preparing to fight the last war, not this one. They expected static trench warfare, artillery duels, slow advances measured in yards. What they got instead was blitzkrieg, lightning war. On May 10, 1940, German forces crashed through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies had deemed impassable for mechanized forces. The French had left it lightly defended. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Within days, German panzer divisions had carved through Allied lines like a hot knife through butter, racing toward the English Channel. The speed was breathtaking, terrifying. The kind of military maneuver that would later inform American armored doctrine, teaching U.S. commanders like Patton and Bradley how modern warfare demanded speed, surprise, and overwhelming force at decisive points. By May 20th, German forces reached the coast at Abbeville, cutting the Allied armies in two. The British Expeditionary Force, the cream of Britain's professional army, along with French and Belgian units, found themselves trapped in an ever-shrinking pocket around the port city of Dunkirk. Behind them, the sea. To their south, east, and west, the German army. 340,000 men faced annihilation. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German Army Group A, couldn't believe his luck. The entire British army, trapped like fish in a barrel. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, boasted to Hitler that his aircraft alone could finish them off. The British, they believed, were finished. Soon, nothing would stand between Germany and total victory in Western Europe. Then, the inevitable invasion of Britain itself.
But the Germans had miscalculated. They hadn't counted on the courage of ordinary men making extraordinary choices. On May 26th, Operation Dynamo began, the evacuation of Dunkirk. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, operating from the Dover Naval Headquarters in tunnels carved beneath Dover Castle, coordinated what would become one of history's most dramatic rescues. The Royal Navy sent every destroyer it could spare, but it wasn't enough. The harbors were under constant bombardment. The ships were sitting ducks for German dive bombers. Ramsay sent out a call for civilian vessels, any boat that could float and cross the channel, fishing trawlers, passenger ferries, private yachts, lifeboats. The little ships of Dunkirk would become legendary. But none of these boats would make it to those beaches if the German army wasn't held back. If the perimeter collapsed, if the panzers broke through and reached the evacuation points, hundreds of thousands would die on those beaches, cut down by machine gun fire and artillery. The war would effectively be over. Britain would sue for peace. And without Britain, America's hopes of ever defeating Nazi Germany would die in the sand at Dunkirk. Someone had to hold the line. Someone had to stay behind. Someone had to die so others could live. The perimeter around Dunkirk was a rough semicircle, about 30 miles wide, anchored on the coast. Every mile of it had to be defended. Every road leading to Dunkirk had to be blocked. Every canal crossing, every village, every farmhouse became a fortress that had to be held as long as possible. The men assigned to the rearguard knew they were being given a death sentence, but they took up their positions anyway. Among these heroes were units of the British 2nd Division under Major General Lloyd, the 44th Division, the 46th Division, French forces from the First Army, including the legendary French 12th Motorized Infantry Division, Belgian troops who fought on even after their king had ordered surrender, and yes, even small detachments of American volunteers who joined Allied forces before Pearl Harbor, men who understood that fighting fascism wasn't just Britain's war, it was humanity's war. But let me tell you about one group in particular. Let me tell you about the defenders of Cassel. Cassel was a small hilltop town about 20 miles south of Dunkirk. Not much to look at. Ancient cobblestone streets, a town square with a centuries-old church, but it sat on one of the few elevated positions in the otherwise flat Flanders Plain. From Cassel, you could see for miles. Control Cassel, and you controlled the roads leading to Dunkirk. Lose Cassel, and German panzers would have a highway straight to the beaches. On May 26th, the British 145th Infantry Brigade was ordered to hold Cassel at all costs. At all costs. Those 3 words carried terrible weight. They meant fight until you're out of ammunition, until you're out of food, until you're dead. Do not retreat. Do not surrender. Hold the line until every last soldier has been evacuated from Dunkirk, even though you won't be among them.
Brigadier Nigel Somerset commanded the 145th. He gathered his officers, young men most of them, lieutenants and captains in their 20s, and explained their mission without sugarcoating it. They would dig in at Cassel. They would fortify every building. When the Germans came, they would make them pay for every inch. How long did they need to hold? As long as possible. 3 days, 4, maybe a week, however long it took. The officers returned to their men and passed along the orders. No one protested. No one complained. These were professional soldiers. They understood what duty meant, what sacrifice meant. One young private wrote in a letter that was later found on his body, "We're staying behind so the others can go home. I wish I could see Mum again, but I'm proud to do my part. Tell her I wasn't scared." He was 21 years old. The defenders of Cassel transformed the town into a fortress. They barricaded streets with overturned vehicles. They positioned anti-tank guns in alleys with overlapping fields of fire.
They filled sandbags and reinforced windows. They set up machine gun nests in upper floors of buildings, giving them clear lines of sight down approaching roads. They knew the German tactics by now. Panzer units would probe defenses, testing for weak spots. Then would come the artillery bombardment, softening up positions. Then infantry, supported by tanks, would assault, overwhelming defenders through superior firepower. The British had to make them pay for every advantage. On the morning of May 27th, German reconnaissance units appeared on the roads leading to Kassel, motorcycle troops, armored cars. They moved cautiously, expecting resistance. They got it. British riflemen, expertly concealed, opened fire at close range. German soldiers dove for cover. The reconnaissance units radioed back. Kassel is defended, heavily defended. The Germans brought up artillery, 88mm guns, the fearsome Flak 88s that could destroy tanks and pulverize buildings with equal efficiency. They began shelling Kassel systematically, walking fire through the town, collapsing walls, starting fires. The British crouched in cellars and behind rubble, enduring the bombardment, waiting. Some prayed, some wrote final letters, some simply sat in silence, smoking cigarettes, thinking about home. Then came the assault. German infantry, advancing in extended lines, supported by panzer tanks. The distinctive sound of tank engines, the clatter of treads on cobblestone, the sharp crack of tank cannons. The British let them come close, holding fire, disciplined, patient. Now, British anti-tank guns opened up at point-blank range. The lead panzer exploded, flames shooting from its hatches as ammunition cooked off inside. A second tank, trying to reverse, threw a tread and slewed sideways, blocking the narrow street. German infantry, suddenly without armor support, found themselves exposed to withering machine gun fire from multiple directions. They fell back, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. The first assault had failed, but there would be more, many more. Over the next 3 days, the Germans attacked Kassel again and again. They brought more artillery, more tanks, more infantry. Stukas, the infamous dive bombers, screamed down on the town, dropping bombs with terrifying precision. Buildings collapsed, fires raged. The British casualties mounted, but they held. Every time the Germans advanced, they met ferocious resistance. British soldiers, down to their last magazines, made every shot count. When they ran out of ammunition for their rifles, they used captured German weapons. When buildings became untenable, they fell back to new positions, making the Germans fight for every street, every house. American military historians who later studied the defense of Kassel marveled at the tactical sophistication demonstrated by these exhausted, outnumbered defenders. They were applying principles of defense in depth that would become standard doctrine for U.S. Army forces in later conflicts. Trading space for time, forcing the enemy to commit resources, making them pay a price so high that even victory felt like defeat. But Kassel was just one position among many on that perimeter. All along the line, other rearguard units were making similar stands. At Bergs, at Ferns, at Newport, at the Aa Canal. Everywhere, small groups of Allied soldiers were buying time with their lives. Let me tell you about the defense of the Ypres-Comines Canal. This waterway, not particularly wide or deep, nevertheless represented a critical barrier. On May 27th, the British 2nd Division was tasked with holding the canal crossings. The Germans needed to cross that canal to reach Dunkirk. They had to be stopped. The defenders dug in along the eastern bank, positioning themselves to cover the bridges and fords. They had precious little artillery support. Most of the heavy guns had already been destroyed or abandoned in the retreat. What they had were rifles, machine guns, a few mortars, and determination that bordered on the superhuman. The German attack came in the afternoon. Heavy artillery preparation first, German doctrine as predictable as it was deadly. Then infantry and tanks rushed the canal, attempting to cross at multiple points simultaneously. The British opened fire. Tracer rounds zipped across the water, stitching lines of death. German soldiers, trying to cross on makeshift bridges, fell into the canal. Tanks, attempting to ford shallow points, got stuck in the mud. One British sergeant, later identified as Sergeant Thomas Williamson of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, found himself commanding a position after all his officers were killed or wounded. German infantry had managed to establish a foothold on the western bank, threatening to envelop his position. Without hesitation, Sergeant Williamson grabbed a Bren gun, a British light machine gun, and charged the German position alone. Firing from the hip, he cut down enemy soldiers, forcing the survivors to retreat back across the canal. He held that position for 6 more hours until he was finally killed by a sniper. His actions saved dozens of lives and delayed the German advance by an entire day. An entire day! That meant another 30,000 soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk. Meanwhile, on the beaches themselves, a different kind of hell was unfolding. The Luftwaffe, Goering's pride and joy, was attempting to make good on his boast to destroy the British Army from the air. Stukas and Messerschmitt fighters roared over the beaches, strafing lines of soldiers waiting to embark. Bombs fell among the dunes, tossing men into the air like rag dolls. Ships, slow and vulnerable while loading, became targets. Several destroyers and transport ships were sunk in the harbor approaches, their loss a devastating blow to evacuation efforts. But here's where American involvement begins to directly impact the story. The Royal Air Force, stretched thin, couldn't provide constant air cover over Dunkirk. British Spitfires and Hurricanes flew mission after mission, their pilots exhausted, often flying 4 or 5 sorties per day. Among these pilots were several American volunteers who joined the RAF before the United States entered the war. Men like Billy Fisk, an American Olympic bobsledder who'd become a Spitfire pilot in RAF Squadron 601. These Americans, fighting fascism before it was official policy, understood what many back home didn't yet grasp. This wasn't just Europe's war. This was a war for the future of civilization itself. Fisk and his fellow pilots threw themselves into the battle over Dunkirk with reckless courage. Outnumbered, often flying outdated aircraft against superior German fighters, they nevertheless took a terrible toll on the Luftwaffe. Every German bomber they shot down was a ship that wouldn't be sunk. Every German fighter they forced to retreat was a strafe run that wouldn't happen. American volunteer pilots flying for the RAF in those desperate days were putting into practice the aggressive fighting spirit that would later characterize the U.S. Army Air Forces in combat, pressing home attacks regardless of odds, protecting ground forces at all costs, seizing and maintaining air superiority through sheer audacity. Back on the perimeter, the rearguard defenders were reaching their breaking point. By May 29th, ammunition was running critically low, food was gone, water was scarce. Medical supplies were exhausted, leaving wounded men to endure agony without morphine or bandages. Men went days without sleep, propped up by nothing but willpower and the knowledge that their brothers were still evacuating behind them. The defense of Kassel finally collapsed on May 29th. After 3 days of continuous fighting, with German forces now attacking from 3 sides, with no ammunition remaining, with half the garrison dead or wounded, Brigadier Somerset gave the order to attempt a breakout. Small groups of soldiers, moving at night, tried to infiltrate through German lines and reach Dunkirk. Most didn't make it. Somerset himself was captured. Of the approximately 4,000 men who defended Kassel, fewer than 300 reached the beaches. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured. But they'd held for 3 days. 3 crucial days. During those 3 days, over 120,000 soldiers had been evacuated from Dunkirk. 120,000 lives, purchased with British blood at Kassel. The French rearguard deserves special mention here because they displayed courage that embodied the finest traditions of Allied cooperation, the kind of unity that would later characterize American-led coalitions in World War II. French General Moulinier commanded the First Army's rear elements, forces that had become separated from the main French armies to the south. These French divisions knew they were cut off, knew they likely wouldn't be evacuated. The British were evacuating primarily British troops. Simple logistics dictated that ships departing from British ports would prioritize British soldiers. But General Moulinier didn't complain, didn't protest. He understood the strategic necessity. Instead, he ordered his forces to fight defensive battles that bought time for everyone: British, French, Belgian. At Lille, 35,000 French troops under Moulinier held out against 7 German divisions for 4 days, tying down forces that otherwise would have crushed the Dunkirk perimeter. When they finally surrendered on May 31st, the German commander, recognizing their valor, allowed them to march out with full military honors before entering captivity. The Americans who later studied these actions, officers like Eisenhower, who would eventually lead Allied forces in Europe, learned critical lessons about coalition warfare, about sacrifice for the common good, about Allied unity in the face of overwhelming odds. These lessons would inform American strategy throughout the war, creating the Allied cooperation that ultimately defeated the Axis powers.
By May 30th, the Dunkirk perimeter had shrunk to just a few miles around the port. The rearguard, those still alive, had been pushed back almost to the beaches themselves. German artillery could now reach the embarkation points directly. Every shell that landed on the beach or in the harbor waters was a potential mass casualty event, soldiers packed together waiting for boats that might never come. And yet, the evacuation continued. The little ships kept coming, ferrying men from the beaches to larger vessels waiting offshore. Royal Navy destroyers, despite losing several ships to air attacks and mines, kept loading soldiers directly from the harbor mole, a long concrete pier that could accommodate larger vessels. The organization, under impossible circumstances, was nothing short of miraculous. American observers, watching from across the channel, took careful notes. The improvised logistics, the civilian-military cooperation, the refusal to accept defeat, these were attributes that would come to define America's own approach to World War II. On May 31st, something remarkable happened. Churchill, under pressure to save as many men as possible, ordered that French troops be evacuated in equal numbers with British troops. British and French boarding together, sharing the same risks, the same boats, the same hope. That day alone, 68,000 men were lifted off the beaches, French and British together. But someone still had to hold the line. The rearguard had been reduced to a thin crust of exhausted survivors. Men who'd been fighting for days without rest, men who'd seen their friends die, men who knew they were among the last who'd never make it home, and still they fought. Let me tell you about Captain Harold Marcus Irvine Andrews of the British East Lancashire Regiment. On May 31st, his company was defending a position near the beach at Dunkirk. German infantry, sensing the evacuation was nearly complete, launched a massive assault, determined to overrun the remaining defenders and reach the beaches. Captain Irvine Andrews, commanding just 60 men, found his position attacked by overwhelming German forces from 3 sides. He ordered his men to take cover, while he, alone, manned a Bren gun positioned to cover the most likely approach route. German soldiers, hundreds of them, advanced across open ground toward his position. Irvine Andrews opened fire. The Bren gun, in the hands of an expert, is a devastating weapon. Accurate, reliable, deadly. He cut down the leading German ranks, then the next wave, then the next. German soldiers tried to flank him. He shifted his fire, catching them in the open. They tried to suppress him with mortar fire. He kept shooting, changing barrels when they overheated, his hands blistering from the heat of the weapon.
For over an hour, Captain Irvine Andrews held that position alone, fighting off an entire German battalion. When he finally ran out of ammunition, he'd killed or wounded an estimated hundreds of German soldiers and delayed their advance long enough for his company and hundreds of other soldiers behind them to withdraw to the evacuation points. He survived the war and was awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valor. But he always maintained he was just doing what needed to be done, what any soldier would have done. That's the spirit that animated the rearguard. Not superhuman fearlessness, but ordinary courage pushed to extraordinary lengths by necessity and duty. By June 2nd, the perimeter had contracted to just the immediate harbor area. The beaches were littered with equipment, vehicles, artillery pieces, supply crates, everything abandoned to save human lives. German forces could see the ships in the harbor. They could watch as the last soldiers were loaded aboard. They threw everything they had at the evacuation: artillery fire, air attacks, infantry assaults. But that thin line of defenders held just long enough. On the night of June 2nd to 3rd, the last British soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk. Captain William Tennant, the senior Royal Navy officer ashore, sent a simple message to Admiral Ramsay in Dover: BEF evacuated. But the French rearguard was still there, still fighting, still holding the perimeter, so the evacuation could continue. On June 3rd, the Royal Navy and the little ships returned one more time, now evacuating French troops. German forces, realizing what was happening, launched their final assault. French soldiers, ammunition exhausted, fought with bayonets and rifle butts. They threw grenades. They fought hand-to-hand in the ruined streets. Some positions were overrun, the defenders killed or captured. But enough held long enough. By the morning of June 4th, Operation Dynamo was complete. 338,000 soldiers had been evacuated from Dunkirk. British, French, Belgian. Soldiers who would live to fight another day. Soldiers who would form the core of armies that would eventually invade Normandy, liberate France, and crush Nazi Germany. 338,000 lives, saved by the sacrifice of the rearguard. Pause. Winston Churchill, addressing Parliament on June 4, 1940, gave one of his most famous speeches. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Stirring words, defiant words. But Churchill knew, and the world would soon learn, that Britain could only continue fighting because of Dunkirk. Because of the evacuation, because of the rearguard. The men who held the perimeter, British, French, Belgian, and American volunteers, didn't get to hear that speech. Many were dead. Thousands more were prisoners in German POW camps, facing years of captivity. They didn't see Britain's continued resistance, didn't see America enter the war after Pearl Harbor, didn't see the tide turn at El Alamein and Stalingrad and Midway, didn't see D-Day. But without them, none of it would have been possible. Without Dunkirk, Britain would have lost its professional army, would have been forced to negotiate peace or face invasion with virtually no trained troops to defend the island. And without Britain remaining in the war, without Britain as a base for American forces, the liberation of Europe would have been impossible. The rearguard at Dunkirk saved more than 300,000 soldiers. They saved the war. They saved the future. American military strategists studying Dunkirk in the years that followed drew important conclusions. They learned that tactical defeats could contain the seeds of strategic victory if soldiers fought with sufficient courage and determination. They learned that holding actions, even hopeless ones, could achieve decisive results if they bought time for larger operations to succeed. And they learned that soldiers willing to sacrifice everything for their comrades embodied the highest ideals of military service, ideals that would come to define the American Armed Forces approach to combat. When American forces landed in Normandy 4 years later, many British veterans of Dunkirk were there, returning to France, this time not in retreat but in triumph. They remembered the beaches, remembered the desperate evacuation, remembered the friends who'd stayed behind so they could escape, and they fought with a fury born of memory and gratitude. The legacy of Dunkirk's rearguard extends beyond World War II. It represents something fundamental about courage and sacrifice. These men weren't superhuman. They were ordinary soldiers, clerks and farmers, factory workers and teachers in civilian life, who found themselves in an impossible situation and chose to do their duty even when that duty demanded everything. Captain Irvine Andrews, asked years later about his actions at Dunkirk, said simply, "Someone had to do it. I happened to be in the right place, or the wrong place, depending on how you look at it." That humility, that sense that heroism is simply duty fulfilled regardless of cost, is what made the greatest generation truly great.
The American volunteers who fought alongside British and French forces at Dunkirk, though small in number, represented something important: the understanding that fascism anywhere threatened freedom everywhere. They fought for that principle before America officially entered the war, and their courage helped inspire American involvement when it finally came. They proved that Americans wouldn't stand idle while tyranny threatened to engulf the world. The little ships of Dunkirk, many of them still preserved today, represent civilian courage, the willingness of ordinary people to sail into danger to save strangers. That same spirit would animate American civilians throughout the war. The workers building Liberty ships at unprecedented speed, the families buying war bonds, the communities rationing food and fuel without complaint. Dunkirk showed what free people could accomplish when they unified against tyranny. The story of Dunkirk's rearguard is ultimately a story about the price of freedom, about men who understood that some things are worth dying for, that their individual lives, precious as they were, mattered less than the survival of their nation and the possibility of eventual victory over evil. Think about that for a moment. Think about being 21 years old on a beach in France, watching boats carry your comrades to safety while you stay behind, knowing you won't make it home, knowing you'll never see your family again, never marry, never have children, never grow old. Your entire future, all your dreams and hopes, sacrificed so others could have theirs. That's what the rearguard did, willingly, without protest, because duty demanded it, because their brothers needed time to escape, because the war needed to continue. The defenders of Cassel, holding that small hilltop town for 3 days against overwhelming odds. Sergeant Williamson, charging a German position alone with a Bren gun. Captain Irvine Andrews, fighting off a battalion single-handedly. The French forces at Lille, accepting capture to buy time. The RAF pilots flying mission after mission until they were shot down or collapsed from exhaustion. The gunners on the beaches, staying at their posts as ships evacuated around them, firing at German aircraft until they ran out of ammunition or were killed. Heroes, every one of them. And their heroism accomplished something extraordinary. Germany had expected to annihilate the British Army, expected Britain to sue for peace, expected to turn their full attention to the Soviet Union without worrying about a Western front. Instead, they found themselves locked in a prolonged conflict that would eventually draw in American power, stretch their resources past breaking, and lead to their utter defeat. All because some men chose to stand and fight at Dunkirk when they could have run. All because some men decided that honor mattered more than survival. All because some men understood that their sacrifice could mean victory for those who came after. When American soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, they were walking in the footsteps of those Dunkirk rearguard defenders. They were fulfilling the promise that those earlier sacrifices had purchased, the promise that tyranny would be defeated, that Europe would be free, that the forces of darkness would not prevail.
General Eisenhower, planning Operation Overlord, had studied Dunkirk extensively. He understood what the rearguard had accomplished. He knew that D-Day was possible because of what happened on those French beaches 4 years earlier. And he made sure that American forces understood they were part of a larger story of Allied courage, a story that began with men who chose death so others could live. The story of Dunkirk's rearguard reminds us that heroism isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about holding the line just long enough. Sometimes it's about making the enemy pay such a price for victory that victory becomes meaningless. Sometimes it's about saving your brothers even when you can't save yourself. These men, British and French and Belgian and American volunteers, wrote a chapter of history with their blood. They proved that even in the darkest hours, even when defeat seems certain, courage and sacrifice can change everything. They showed that free men fighting for something greater than themselves are the most powerful force on earth. So remember the rearguard. Remember Cassel and Ypres Comines and Lille. Remember the defenders who stayed behind. Remember Captain Irvin Andrews and Sergeant Williamson and Brigadier Somerset and General Muligny. Remember the thousands whose names we'll never know, who died in unmarked graves or prison camps, who sacrificed their futures so we could have ours. Remember that freedom isn't free, that victory isn't inevitable, that tyranny must be resisted, whatever the cost. The rearguard at Dunkirk understood these truths and lived them and died for them in the spring of 1940. Their sacrifice made D-Day possible, made victory possible, made the world we live in today possible. And that's why their story matters. That's why we must never forget. Because in remembering their courage, we find the strength to face our own challenges, our own moments of testing. We remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when duty calls. We remember that sacrifice for others is the highest form of love. We remember that some things are worth dying for. The rearguard at Dunkirk didn't live to see victory, but they made victory possible. They are the unsung heroes who changed history by refusing to abandon their post, refusing to give up, refusing to let their brothers die when they could save them. If you've been moved by this story of courage and sacrifice, hit that subscribe button now. Because history is filled with stories like this, untold tales of bravery, of individuals who changed the course of wars and nations, of ordinary people who became extraordinary when the moment demanded it. The men of Dunkirk's rearguard didn't fight for glory or recognition. They fought because it was their duty, because their brothers needed them, because freedom required their sacrifice. That's the spirit that defines not just the greatest generation, but every generation that has fought for liberty against tyranny. Remember them, honor them, and never forget that the world you live in today was purchased with their blood on the beaches of Dunkirk in May and June of 1940. Remember Dunkirk. Remember the rearguard. Remember the price of freedom.